Some people think a badge gives them the right to decide who belongs. But on this morning, one man was about to learn that the law has a face he never expected. The sun had barely climbed above the skyline when the granite steps of Jefferson County Courthouse began filling with attorneys carrying leather briefcases, reporters balancing cameras on their shoulders, and ordinary citizens preparing for another day inside the justice system. The air felt crisp, the kind of cool spring morning where every sound seemed sharper than usual. Car doors closed with hollow echoes. Polished dress shoes tapped across the sidewalk, and courthouse flags drifted gently in the breeze, as if nothing extraordinary could possibly happen there. Yet beneath the calm surface, a single decision was already setting the stage for a moment that would leave an entire crowd speechless. Officer Matthew Collins adjusted the collar of his neatly pressed uniform and stepped away from his patrol vehicle parked along the curb. He had spent nearly 12 years wearing the badge, and somewhere along the way confidence had hardened into certainty. He believed he could read people within seconds. He trusted his instincts more than facts, more than questions, and sometimes even more than procedure. To those who knew him, he carried himself with the unmistakable attitude of a man who expected immediate obedience. His badge rested proudly against his chest, catching the early sunlight every time he moved. As pedestrians streamed toward the courthouse entrance, Matthew scanned every face with practiced suspicion. Then he noticed a tall black man walking alone toward the front steps. The man wore a perfectly tailored Navy suit, carried a slim leather portfolio beneath one arm, and moved with quiet confidence that never demanded attention. His silver tie clip reflected the morning light, while his polished shoes landed with calm, measured steps. He acknowledged the courthouse staff with polite nods, yet spoke to no one. There was nothing hurried about him, nothing nervous, nothing unusual except, in Matthew's mind, the unsettling confidence of someone he immediately decided did not belong. That man was Judge Samuel Richardson, although no one standing nearby realized how important the next few seconds would become. Samuel preferred arriving without an escort or unnecessary attention. Throughout his career, he believed respect was earned through integrity rather than display. Years on the bench had taught him patience, restraint, and the value of listening before speaking. This morning, he was preparing to preside over one of the city's most closely watched hearings, a case drawing lawyers, journalists, and community leaders from across the county. Inside the leather portfolio rested carefully organized legal notes that represented weeks of preparation. Outside, however, none of that mattered to the man now walking directly toward him. Matthew stepped into Samuel's path, raising one hand firmly enough to stop him before he reached the courthouse entrance. Conversations nearby began to soften as curious eyes drifted toward the unexpected encounter. Samuel stopped without protest and looked calmly at the officer standing before him. Neither man spoke for a brief moment. One carried authority granted by a uniform. The other carried authority earned through a lifetime devoted to justice. Neither realized that within seconds, every camera pointed toward the courthouse would capture a confrontation that people across the country would soon remember. Judge Samuel Richardson met Officer Matthew Collins with the same composed expression he had worn through decades of difficult hearings, complicated rulings, and emotionally charged courtrooms. His calmness was not an attempt to challenge the officer. It was simply who he had become after years of believing that dignity should never depend on someone else's behavior. He shifted the leather portfolio slightly beneath his arm and answered in an even voice, "Good morning, officer. Is there something I can help you with?" Matthew barely acknowledged the greeting. His eyes remained fixed on Samuel with growing certainty, convinced that confidence itself was suspicious. "Identification," he said firmly. Now, around them, courthouse employees slowed their pace. Attorneys waiting near the security entrance exchanged uncertain glances before pretending to continue their conversations. A television reporter preparing for a morning live segment instinctively pointed her camera toward the unusual encounter. No one interrupted. Government buildings had taught people that uniforms usually controlled the story. Samuel nodded politely. "Of course." He carefully placed his portfolio on a nearby stone bench, making slow and deliberate movements that could not reasonably be misunderstood. Reaching into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket, he retrieved a leather wallet containing several identification cards. Before he could fully present them, Matthew raised his hand. "Leave them where I can see them." Samuel paused exactly as instructed. His expression never changed. "I am complying." The words were quiet, measured, and completely free of anger. Somehow that composure only seemed to frustrate Matthew further. In his experience, people either argued or apologized. This man did neither. Instead, he remained remarkably calm, as though he understood something everyone else had missed. Matthew took a step closer. "What is your business here today?" Samuel answered truthfully. "I have official responsibilities inside the courthouse." Matthew gave a short, skeptical laugh. "Everybody says they have important business when they get stopped." The nearby crowd grew larger without meaning to. Courthouse clerks stood near the entrance pretending to organize paperwork while secretly watching. A pair of law students whispered to each other before falling silent again. Even passing commuters slowed their pace after noticing several cameras turning toward the sidewalk. Samuel could feel dozens of eyes resting on him, yet he refused to allow embarrassment to dictate his response. He had spent an entire career reminding others that respect for the law began with respect for people. Today, that belief would be tested outside the very building where he defended it every day. "Officer," Samuel said gently, "if there is a misunderstanding, I am happy to clarify it." Matthew folded his arms across his chest. "Then explain why someone matching your description has been reported near this courthouse." Samuel looked at him for a brief moment before answering. "May I ask what description you are referring to?" Matthew did not answer directly. Instead, he glanced toward the courthouse entrance and back again, convinced his instincts were enough. The silence stretched across the granite steps. Somewhere above them, the courthouse clock struck 9, each bell echoing through the plaza like a quiet warning that time was moving toward something neither man could stop. Standing only a few feet apart, one believed authority came from the badge pinned to his uniform. The other understood that true authority survived even when no one recognized it. Within moments, the balance between those two beliefs would begin to change in front of everyone. Watching, Matthew Collins studied Samuel Richardson for another long moment, searching for hesitation that never appeared. The quiet confidence standing before him did not fit the assumptions already forming in his mind. And instead of questioning those assumptions, he became even more determined to prove himself right. Around the courthouse plaza, the ordinary rhythm of the morning had slowed almost to a standstill. Lawyers delayed entering the security checkpoint. Reporters lowered their voices but kept their cameras pointed toward the sidewalk. Even the courthouse security officers standing inside the glass entrance exchanged uncertain looks without stepping outside. Everyone sensed that something unusual was unfolding, yet no one fully understood why. Samuel remained exactly where he was, his hands visible, his posture relaxed, and his attention focused entirely on the officer in front of him. Years on the bench had taught him that people often revealed themselves most clearly during moments of pressure. Raising his voice would accomplish nothing. Losing his composure would only encourage misunderstanding. He had spent decades asking witnesses to remain calm under difficult circumstances. Now, he silently held himself to the same standard. Matthew glanced toward the leather portfolio resting on the stone bench. "What is inside the case?" he demanded. Samuel answered immediately. "Court documents, legal research, and my schedule for today's hearings." Matthew frowned. "Open it." Without hesitation, Samuel stepped carefully toward the bench after receiving a brief nod from the officer. He placed the portfolio flat on the smooth stone surface, released the brass clasp, and slowly lifted the cover. Inside were neatly organized folders, a legal notebook filled with handwritten observations, several bound case files, and a copy of the United States Constitution with worn edges from years of use. There was nothing unusual, nothing hidden, nothing that matched the suspicion growing inside Matthew's mind. Yet instead of easing the tension, the ordinary contents seemed to frustrate him even more. He flipped through several folders without finding anything remarkable before closing the portfolio again. "You carry a lot of paperwork," he remarked with obvious skepticism. Samuel replied calmly, "It is part of my profession." Once again, he chose not to elaborate. Nearby, an older attorney quietly recognized the familiar leather portfolio and looked twice at the man standing beside it. His eyes widened with recognition. But before he could step forward, another colleague gently placed a hand on his arm and whispered something that caused both men to remain still. They appeared uncertain whether interrupting a police investigation would improve the situation or make it worse. Across the plaza, a courthouse maintenance worker removed his cap and stared in disbelief, while a young law clerk instinctively reached for her phone, sensing history might be unfolding before her eyes. Matthew noticed none of it. His attention remained fixed on Samuel, convinced that every calm answer concealed another unanswered question. "You seem unusually comfortable for someone being investigated," he observed. Samuel gave a thoughtful smile that barely lasted a second. "Respectfully, officer, remaining calm is usually the best choice for everyone involved." Those words drifted across the quiet courthouse steps with unexpected weight. Several people standing nearby lowered their eyes, recognizing the quiet wisdom behind them. Matthew, however, interpreted the response differently. To him, it sounded less like patience and more like confidence that challenged his authority. He took one deliberate step closer, unaware that the courthouse doors had just opened behind him and that several senior officials were beginning to walk outside, expecting to welcome the presiding judge to the most important hearing of the week. Ignoring the growing attention around them, Matthew Collins folded the portfolio shut and placed one hand firmly on top of it. "You are not going anywhere until I understand exactly who you are and why you are here," he declared. His voice carried across the courthouse plaza, causing even more people to stop and watch. The atmosphere changed almost instantly. Conversations faded into whispers. A pair of television photographers quietly adjusted their camera angles, sensing that the routine morning assignment had become something much larger. Samuel Richardson looked directly at the officer with steady eyes that reflected neither fear nor anger. "Officer Collins," he replied in a measured tone, "I have answered every question you have asked. I have cooperated with every instruction. If there is additional information you need, I will gladly provide it." Matthew shook his head. "That is not how this works." He took another step forward, placing himself squarely between Samuel and the courthouse entrance. "You do not decide when this conversation is over." "Ido." Samuel remained silent for a moment, studying the younger man with quiet patience. He had spent years watching people allow pride to replace judgment, and he recognized the same pattern unfolding now. Still, he believed every person deserved the opportunity to reconsider before making a mistake they could not easily undo. "May I ask one question?" Samuel said calmly. Matthew crossed his arms. "Make it quick. Have you confirmed my identity through dispatch?" The simple question lingered in the air. Matthew hesitated for only a fraction of a second before answering. "I do not need dispatch to tell me what I already see." Several people standing nearby exchanged uneasy glances. An experienced defense attorney slowly removed his glasses, unable to believe what he was hearing. A courthouse clerk quietly whispered he should verify first. Another employee nodded but remained frozen, uncertain whether speaking up would only complicate the situation. Samuel noticed the concern spreading through the crowd, yet he refused to encourage it. "Verification protects everyone," he said evenly. "It protects citizens and it protects officers." Instead of considering those words, Matthew interpreted them as another challenge to his authority. "Save the lecture," he answered sharply. "You are avoiding my questions." Samuel gently shook his head. "No, officer. I have answered every question truthfully." The courthouse clock continued marking the passing minutes, while the hearing scheduled inside edged closer to its opening. Court staff standing behind the glass entrance checked their watches repeatedly. Judges rarely arrived late, especially Judge Samuel Richardson. The chief courtroom deputy looked toward the front steps with growing concern before quietly stepping outside to search for him. She could already see a crowd gathered near the sidewalk, but from that distance, she could not yet distinguish the faces. Meanwhile, Matthew reached toward his radio, requesting additional officers to assist with what he described as an uncooperative individual requiring further investigation. The words caused a visible ripple through the spectators because nothing they had witnessed suggested resistance of any kind. Samuel simply listened without interruption. He slowly folded his hands in front of him and looked briefly toward the courthouse entrance, where several familiar colleagues were beginning to emerge through the revolving doors. None of them had spoken yet. None of them had fully realized what they were seeing. But within only a few more moments, the truth would step into full view, and the assumptions carrying this encounter forward would begin to collapse under the weight of undeniable reality. The second patrol vehicle arrived quietly, its tires rolling to a stop along the courthouse curb as two additional officers stepped onto the sidewalk. They immediately looked toward Matthew Collins, waiting for direction before speaking. Matthew pointed toward Samuel Richardson with unwavering confidence. "Remain here until we finish identifying him," he instructed. Neither officer questioned the order, but both noticed something unusual almost immediately. The man standing before them showed no signs of panic, frustration, or confusion. Instead, he carried himself with the calm confidence of someone completely at peace despite becoming the center of unwanted attention. Samuel offered each arriving officer a polite nod, the same respectful acknowledgement he would have given anyone entering his courtroom. One of the younger officers hesitated before returning the greeting, sensing that something about the encounter did not fit the picture he had been given. Around them, the crowd had nearly doubled. Reporters quietly adjusted microphones, while camera operators captured every moment from different angles. Several courthouse employees gathered just inside the entrance behind the glass doors, watching with growing concern. A legal assistant whispered, "Why has Judge Richardson not come inside yet?" Another employee looked toward the sidewalk and froze. She recognized the familiar Navy suit immediately, but could not believe what she was seeing. Before she could react, the chief courtroom deputy stepped beside her and followed her gaze. His face changed instantly. "That cannot be happening," he murmured under his breath. Outside, Matthew continued speaking with complete certainty. "You have had every opportunity to explain yourself," he said. "Instead, you keep giving vague answers." Samuel answered with the same steady voice that had never risen above conversation level. "Officer Collins, I have answered each question honestly. You have every right to verify my identity through official channels. I encourage you to do so." Matthew shook his head again. "I will determine how this investigation proceeds." Samuel simply replied, "Very well." His willingness to cooperate puzzled even the officers standing beside Matthew. They had expected arguments, demands, or emotional reactions. Instead, they found themselves watching a man whose composure seemed impossible to disturb. The contrast quietly shifted the mood of the spectators. Some who had initially trusted the officer's judgment now began questioning whether they had witnessed enough to support his conclusions. Others noticed details they had overlooked before: the expensive yet understated suit, the carefully organized legal documents, the polished manner of speaking, the quiet confidence that came not from arrogance, but from experience. Across the plaza, the courthouse doors finally opened wider as several senior officials stepped outside together. Leading them was Chief Judge Harold Bennett, accompanied by the clerk of court, the court administrator, and two judicial marshals. Their expressions carried mild concern at first, assuming perhaps a traffic delay or routine security matter had interrupted the morning schedule. But as they moved closer and recognized the man standing beside the stone bench, every one of them slowed to a stop. The chief judge removed his glasses, staring across the plaza in complete disbelief. The clerk looked from Samuel to Matthew and back again, unable to process what she was witnessing. Even the judicial marshals, trained to remain composed under pressure, exchanged stunned glances. Matthew remained unaware of the silent audience gathering behind him. His focus never left Samuel Richardson. He believed he still controlled the situation. He believed he still understood exactly who stood before him. But only a few yards away, people who knew the truth had just arrived, and the quiet confidence Samuel had carried throughout the entire encounter was finally about to make perfect sense to everyone except the one man who needed to understand it most. Chief Judge Harold Bennett could not remain silent another second. His voice carried across the courthouse plaza with unmistakable authority. "Judge Richardson." The simple greeting echoed through the morning air, and dozens of heads turned toward the courthouse entrance at the exact same moment. Samuel Richardson looked over his shoulder and answered with a respectful nod. "Good morning, Chief Judge." The words seemed to freeze time itself. Matthew Collins stared first at the senior officials walking toward them, and then back at the man standing only a few feet away. His expression shifted from certainty to confusion. The two additional officers exchanged uneasy glances, silently realizing they had just heard the title spoken clearly and without hesitation. Chief Judge Bennett continued walking until he stood directly beside Samuel. "We have been waiting for you," he said. "The courtroom is prepared, the attorneys are assembled, and everyone has been asking where you are." Samuel answered calmly, "I was delayed outside." He did not accuse anyone. He did not raise his voice. He simply stated the truth. The chief judge slowly turned toward Matthew. "Officer, would you please explain why one of the presiding judges of this courthouse has been prevented from entering his own building?" The question landed with extraordinary weight. Every nearby conversation stopped. Every camera remained fixed on the unfolding scene. Matthew opened his mouth, but no words came. His confidence, so steady only moments before, suddenly had nothing to support it. He glanced toward Samuel's leather portfolio, then toward the courthouse entrance, searching for an explanation that no longer existed. The court administrator stepped forward carrying a thick schedule binder. Without saying a word, she opened it to the morning docket and held it where everyone nearby could see. Printed across the top of the page appeared the words, "Presiding Judge, Samuel Richardson." Several reporters quietly zoomed their cameras closer. One legal correspondent lowered her microphone, whispering to her producer, "Keep rolling." Nearby attorneys who had watched the encounter from the beginning slowly shook their heads in disbelief. The younger officer, standing beside Matthew, quietly took one step backward, instinctively creating space between himself and a situation that had changed completely. Chief Judge Bennett spoke again, his tone remaining professional but unmistakably serious. "Judge Richardson has served this courthouse with distinction for many years. He is expected in courtroom 1 within minutes." Was his identification verified before this delay occurred? Matthew hesitated. "No, sir." Was dispatch contacted? "No, sir." Was any courthouse official asked to confirm his identity? Matthew lowered his eyes. "No, sir." The silence that followed seemed louder than any argument could have been. Samuel stood exactly as he had throughout the encounter, composed and patient. He looked toward Matthew not with satisfaction, but with quiet disappointment. "Officer Collins," he said gently, "verification exists for moments exactly like this. It protects every person involved." Those standing nearby understood immediately that the lesson reached far beyond one mistaken stop. It spoke to responsibility, restraint, and the danger of replacing facts with assumptions. Chief Judge Bennett nodded slowly before addressing the judicial marshals. "Please escort Judge Richardson inside. We will ensure the morning proceedings begin immediately." As the marshals respectfully stepped beside Samuel, courthouse employees instinctively moved aside to clear a path. Every person watching now understood who had truly been standing on those courthouse steps all along. Only Matthew Collins remained motionless, his badge still resting against his uniform, but suddenly feeling far lighter than the responsibility it represented as Judge Samuel Richardson walked through the courthouse entrance beside the judicial marshals. Every conversation in the grand lobby seemed to dissolve into silence. Attorneys who had been reviewing case files lowered their folders. Court clerks paused in the middle of routine conversations. Even visitors waiting for security screening instinctively stepped aside, sensing that something extraordinary had just happened outside. Samuel acknowledged each person with the same quiet dignity he displayed every morning, refusing to let the uncomfortable encounter define the beginning of the day. Behind him, however, the consequences were already beginning to unfold. Chief Judge Harold Bennett remained outside with Officer Matthew Collins. His voice stayed calm, but every word carried the unmistakable weight of accountability. "Officer Collins," he began, "this courthouse depends upon professionalism, impartiality, and verified facts. Those principles protect every citizen who enters these doors, including those who wear a badge." Matthew swallowed hard. The certainty that had guided him only minutes earlier had disappeared completely. He looked toward the courthouse entrance, where Judge Richardson had vanished from sight, realizing that every assumption he had trusted had been made without taking the simplest investigative step. Before he could answer, another vehicle quietly pulled to the curb. A supervisor from the police department stepped out after receiving a brief radio notification that an incident involving courthouse personnel required immediate review. Captain Laura Henderson approached with measured confidence, greeting the chief judge before turning toward Matthew. "Officer Collins," she said evenly, "I need a brief explanation of what occurred." Matthew hesitated, searching for words that sounded reasonable. He described the stop, his suspicions, and the questions he had asked, but each sentence only highlighted one fact he could no longer avoid. He had never confirmed the identity of the individual standing before him. Captain Henderson listened without interruption. When he finished, she asked only one question. "Did you verify any information before extending the encounter?" Matthew lowered his eyes once again. "No, Captain." She nodded slowly, neither angry nor emotional. "Then the department will need to review every available record, including dispatch communications, body camera footage, public security video, and witness statements." The surrounding reporters quietly exchanged glances. They understood that the story had moved beyond a mistaken stop. It had become a lesson about procedure, judgment, and responsibility. Several courthouse employees who had witnessed the entire encounter were respectfully asked to provide contact information in case formal statements became necessary. No one celebrated. No one applauded. The mood remained solemn because everyone understood that trust in public institutions depended upon moments exactly like this being examined honestly. Inside Courtroom 1, Judge Richardson placed his leather portfolio upon the bench and prepared for the morning hearing as though nothing extraordinary had happened. His courtroom staff watched him with quiet admiration. One clerk finally spoke. "Judge, are you all right?" Samuel offered a gentle smile. "I am ready to begin." He did not mention the delay. He did not criticize anyone. Instead, he opened the first case file and reviewed his notes with the same careful attention he always gave every person seeking justice inside his courtroom. Outside, Captain Henderson informed Matthew that he would be temporarily relieved from active field duties while the department completed its administrative review. Matthew silently removed his patrol assignment notebook and handed it to another officer. As he stood on the same courthouse steps where he had believed complete confidence was enough, he finally understood that authority without verification could never earn lasting respect. For the first time that morning, he looked at the courthouse not as a place where power was exercised, but as a place where truth was expected to speak louder than assumptions. The administrative review began the very next morning inside police headquarters, far from television cameras and courthouse steps, but no less important than the events that had unfolded in public. Body camera recordings were examined minute by minute. Dispatch logs were compared against officer reports. Security cameras positioned outside Jefferson County Courthouse captured the entire interaction from multiple angles, confirming the sequence exactly as dozens of witnesses had described it. There had been no attempt by Judge Samuel Richardson to avoid questions. There had been no refusal to cooperate. Every request had been met with patience. Every instruction followed with respect, and every opportunity to verify his identity had gone unused. Captain Laura Henderson sat at the end of the conference table reviewing the final timeline, while members of the department's professional standards division quietly compared notes. No one rushed to conclusions. Every statement was measured against evidence, because that was the standard expected from every investigation. Meanwhile, life inside the courthouse continued with remarkable consistency. Judge Richardson presided over each hearing with the same calm fairness that had earned him respect. Throughout his career, lawyers appearing before him noticed nothing different in his demeanor. He listened carefully, treated every person with equal courtesy, and reminded juries that justice demanded facts rather than assumptions. Those words carried deeper meaning for several people seated inside the courtroom who had witnessed the encounter outside only one day earlier. News of the incident spread throughout the legal community, not because of dramatic headlines, but because so many professionals recognized how easily confidence could replace careful judgment when procedures were ignored. Across the city, discussions quietly emerged inside law schools, police training classrooms, and legal offices. The conversation was not about one officer alone. It became a reminder that authority carries its greatest value only when paired with humility and verification. Back at headquarters, Matthew Collins sat alone in a small interview room waiting to speak with investigators. For the first time in many years, he watched portions of his own body camera footage without the certainty that had guided him in the field. He noticed details that had escaped him during the encounter itself. Samuel's calm responses, his repeated encouragement to verify identity, his willingness to cooperate from beginning to end. Watching those moments from an objective perspective felt very different from living them in real time. Each replay exposed another opportunity where a simple radio call could have changed everything. When Captain Henderson entered the room, she placed the completed review file on the table before speaking. "This investigation is about conduct, not embarrassment," she said evenly. Public trust depends upon decisions made during ordinary moments. Those moments become extraordinary only when procedures are ignored. Matthew nodded quietly. He offered no excuses because none remained. Several days later, the department announced the outcome of its administrative review. Appropriate disciplinary action was taken according to departmental policy. Additional procedural training was required, and leadership introduced updated verification guidelines designed to reduce similar incidents in the future. The announcement emphasized accountability, fairness, and continuous improvement rather than public humiliation. Judge Richardson received a formal letter acknowledging the unnecessary delay and reaffirming the department's commitment to impartial service for every member of the community. He accepted the letter with quiet professionalism and returned to his responsibilities without seeking attention or recognition. To him, the most meaningful outcome was not an apology on paper, but the possibility that future decisions would begin with facts instead of assumptions. Sometimes the strongest form of justice is not found in punishment alone. Sometimes it appears when an entire institution chooses to learn from one difficult morning and become stronger because it refuses to ignore the truth 1 week later. The courthouse looked exactly as it always had. The marble floors reflected the morning sunlight. Attorneys hurried toward their courtrooms carrying stacks of files. Families waited quietly on polished wooden benches, hoping for fair hearings and honest decisions. To most visitors, it was simply another ordinary day inside the justice system. Yet for many who worked there, the events of the previous week had left a lasting impression that would not easily fade. Judge Samuel Richardson walked through the front entrance with the same leather portfolio resting beneath his arm. The security officers greeted him with genuine respect, and he returned every greeting with the same warm professionalism that had defined his career. Nothing about his routine had changed because he had never allowed one difficult moment to determine his character. Inside Courtroom 1, he took his seat behind the bench and carefully reviewed the first case scheduled for the morning. Before the proceedings began, he looked across the courtroom filled with attorneys, jurors, court staff, and members of the public. His voice remained calm and steady as always. Every person who enters this courtroom deserves to be heard through facts, not assumptions. That principle protects every citizen, and it also protects the integrity of the law itself. The courtroom became perfectly still. Those who knew what had happened outside the courthouse understood that his words carried the quiet strength of experience rather than resentment. There was no anger in his voice. There was no desire for revenge. Only a reminder that justice must begin with fairness long before any verdict is reached. Across town, Officer Matthew Collins continued participating in additional professional training required by his department. The lessons focused on communication, procedural verification, and impartial decision-making. For the first time in his career, he listened more than he spoke. He reviewed policies that he had once believed were merely formalities and began to understand why every step existed. Procedures were not obstacles. They were safeguards protecting officers and citizens alike. The badge represented public trust, and trust could never depend upon assumptions. Months later, Matthew requested an opportunity to meet privately with Judge Richardson through the appropriate channels. The meeting lasted only a few minutes inside the judge's chambers. Matthew spoke honestly. He accepted responsibility for his decisions without blaming circumstances or anyone else. Samuel listened quietly before offering a simple response. Growth begins the moment we choose truth over pride. There are no dramatic speeches, no applause, no celebration. Just two men leaving the room with a clearer understanding of what accountability truly required. As the courthouse clock marked another ordinary afternoon, life continued much as it always had. Cases were heard. Families found resolution. Juries reached verdicts. The building remained what it had always been meant to represent, not perfection, but the constant pursuit of fairness. Long after the cameras disappeared and public attention moved elsewhere, one lesson continued echoing through its hallways. A uniform may command attention, and a title may command respect, but neither can replace integrity. Real justice is never measured by how quickly someone exercises authority. It is measured by the wisdom to seek the truth before reaching a conclusion. Because on that unforgettable morning outside the courthouse, one man believed he was judging another. In the end, it was his own judgment that faced the greatest test, and the lesson left behind would remind everyone who heard the story that the strongest foundation of justice will always be humility, fairness, and the courage to let facts speak before assumptions ever have a chance.